The cameras were still rolling when I pulled the microphone off my jacket and set it on the desk. 40 million people had tuned in to watch me destroy the myth of a dead teenager. And instead, I had just said, on live television, that I could no longer do this job. My producer was screaming in my earpiece. The anchor beside me had frozen, his smile cracking at the edges. And I just kept staring into the camera, because somewhere behind that red light were the eyes of everyone who had ever heard me mock the very thing I had just discovered was true. I had built my entire career tearing down belief. 3 days earlier, I had walked into Assisi with a file thick enough to bury a saint. And now, I was walking out of a television studio with nothing. No contract, no reputation, no certainty about anything I had ever believed. My name is Diana Holloway. I was an investigative journalist for 19 years, and for the last 6 of those, I worked as the lead religion correspondent for one of the largest broadcast networks in the world. I have interviewed cardinals and con artists, faith healers and frauds. I won 2 national awards for exposing a megachurch that laundered $11 million through a fake orphanage. I did not believe in God. I did not believe in miracles. I believed in documents, in financial records, in the moment a liar's eyes flick to the left. I was an atheist, not the gentle kind who shrugs and says they're not sure, the kind who had a framed quote from Christopher Hitchens above her desk, the kind who took it personally. My one indulgence was that every morning I made coffee in a chipped blue cup my late father had used, and I drank it black, alone, before the world woke up. That cup is the only thing in this story I still own. What the cameraman caught that morning broke no rule of journalism. I had simply stopped reading from the script. And what I had hidden in the inner lining of my coat that day, a sealed envelope a dying woman's son had handed me with one instruction, was the reason I quit. But I didn't open it then. I carried it for 3 years. When I finally did, in a hospital in Sao Paulo, in the exact place a boy I never met had said I would be, I fell to my knees on a tile floor and wept like a child. For 3 years, I stayed silent about all of it. Today, I tell it all. It started with an assignment I asked for. I want that on the record, because later people would say I was sent, that the network forced my hand. No, I went to my editor-in-chief myself. It was February of the year they were preparing the canonization. The Vatican had announced that a 15-year-old Italian boy named Carlo Acutis, dead since 2006, would be declared a saint. The press had already crowned him with nicknames that made my skin crawl. The first millennial saint, God's influencer, the patron saint of the internet. A boy in sneakers and a backpack, they said, who built a website about Eucharistic miracles before he died of leukemia at 15, and whose body had supposedly been found incorrupt when they exhumed it. To me, it read like a marketing campaign. A church bleeding members in Europe and America, suddenly producing a photogenic teenager in a tracksuit, perfect for the algorithm. I told my editor I could take it apart in 6 weeks. I told him I would find the hidden donors, the manufactured testimonies, the cosmetic work done on a corpse and sold as a miracle. He gave me the budget and a producer named Ravi, and 8 weeks. I started the way I always start, with money and bodies. The exhumation records were public, or supposed to be. The body of Carlo Acutis had been exhumed in 2019, ahead of his beatification, and moved to the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Assisi. The official statement used the word integral, not incorrupt in the medieval sense. The diocese was careful to clarify. The body had undergone natural processes, and the face the pilgrims see is covered with a silicone mask. I seized on that immediately. A mask, a reconstruction. I had my opening shot. I could already hear my own voiceover. What the faithful kneel before is not a miracle. It is a wax figure. I requested the medical and forensic documentation from the 2019 exhumation, and here is the first thing that did not fit. The diocese sent it to me. All of it. Without conditions, without a lawyer present, without the stalling I had come to expect from every institution I had ever investigated. The fraud cases of my career had one thing in common. People who hide something make you fight for every page. The Diocese of Assisi handed me a folder 40 pages thick and a phone number, and said in effect, "Ask us anything." That was not how guilty people behaved. But I told myself the cleverest ones know transparency is the best disguise. I flew to Italy on the 4th of March. The folder traveled in the inner pocket of my coat, against my chest, the whole flight. I didn't know yet that within a week, something else would be riding in that same pocket, something I was forbidden to open. For now, there was only paper, and my certainty, and the cold professional pleasure of a hunt beginning. When I landed in Rome and drove the 2.5 hours north to Assisi, I had my whole investigation mapped. I would discredit the body, I would trace the money behind the website, and I would find the family, the mother, Antonia Salzano, and I would catch her in the small human contradictions that every grieving parent makes when they have turned a dead child into an industry. I had done it before. I was good at it, and I had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to me. The first crack in my certainty was a temperature. It came from a place I never expected. I had decided to start not with Carlo at all, but with the thing his website was built around, the eucharistic miracles he had cataloged. If I could show that the foundation of the boy's fame was superstition and bad science, the rest would crumble. There were over 160 cases on his site, drawn from across the world and centuries of history. I chose the most modern, most testable one I could find on European soil, a case in Buenos Aires that had been studied in a laboratory. I reached out to a forensic pathologist I'll call Dr. Eduardo Ferri, a man who had no connection to the church and had been hired years earlier, blind, to analyze a tissue sample with no knowledge of where it came from. I expected an embarrassed scientist who would tell me the whole thing was overblown. What he told me, over a bad phone connection, was a number. The sample, he said, was cardiac tissue, specifically myocardium, heart muscle, from the left ventricle, and it showed signs of acute inflammation, the kind you see in a heart under extreme stress, in a person who has suffered and is still, at the cellular level, alive. White blood cells had penetrated the tissue. That only happens, he said, when blood is actively moving, in living tissue. I wrote down the words and felt nothing yet. It was just data. So I pushed. I asked him what he was told the sample was. "They told me nothing," he said. "I was given a fragment and asked to determine if it was human, what organ, and the cause of any trauma. I concluded it was human cardiac tissue from a living person in distress. I assumed it was a homicide victim." Then he told me what the sample actually was. It was a fragment of a consecrated host that had begun, in 1996, to bleed. I hung up and told myself the chain of custody was the weakness. A sample handled by believers could be tampered with, swapped, contaminated. So I requested the laboratory documentation. The blood type they had determined was AB, the same type found, I would later read, on the Shroud of Turin and in several other examined Eucharistic events across centuries and continents that had no contact with one another. That was the first number that bothered me. Not because it proved anything, because it didn't break the way frauds break. Every fraud I had ever exposed fell apart when you pulled one thread. You found the one document that didn't match, the one date that was impossible, the one witness whose story contradicted the others. I pulled the Buenos Aires thread expecting it to unravel, and instead the other end was tied to a thread in Lanciano, Italy, from the 8th century, and that one was tied to one in Mexico, and the knots only got tighter the harder I pulled. I changed my approach. I would stop chasing the miracles, which were old and tangled, and go straight for the boy. A boy who died in 2006 had a paper trail, medical records, school records, a real body in a real morgue. I would find the seam there. I drove to Monza, to the hospital where Carlo Acutis had died, and I asked to speak to anyone who had been present in October 2006. The hospital's press office gave me, again, almost no resistance. They put me in touch with a retired nurse, a woman in her 70s named Liana, who had been on the oncology ward the week the boy died. I met her in a cafe near the hospital. I had my recorder running and my list of questions designed to expose sentimentality dressed up as testimony. I asked her to describe the boy's final days clinically. The leukemia he had was M3, acute promyelocytic, fast, brutal, the kind that can kill in days. He had been admitted, diagnosed, and was dead within a week. He was 15. Liana described it all calmly. The fevers, the internal bleeding that comes with that form of leukemia. And then she said something that wasn't on any of my documents, and she said it without drama, stirring her coffee. He told us he was offering it up, she said. All of it. The pain. He said he was offering his suffering for the Pope and for the Church. A boy that age, in that state? She paused. I have watched many people die on that ward. They scream, they beg, they curse God. He thanked us. The morning he died, he asked one of the doctors not to be sad. I asked her, in the flat voice I used to corner people, whether anyone had coached him to say those things, whether the family had a priest scripting his words for posterity. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something I have never been able to forget. "You came here to find a liar," she said. "I can see it on your face. I have nothing to gain from you. I'm an old woman and I'll be dead before this video of yours airs. So believe me or don't. That boy was not acting. I have seen actors die. He was not one of them." I left Monza unsettled, and I told myself it was jet lag. But that night in my hotel, I couldn't sleep, and around 2 a.m, I did something I hadn't done since I was a child. I tried to remember if I had ever believed anything, and I couldn't. The next morning, I drove to Assisi to do the thing I had really come to do. I was going to meet his mother, and I was going to break her. If this is already stirring something in you that you didn't expect to feel, that strange pull toward a boy you maybe never heard of until today, I want to give you something before I go further. I prepared a free novena to Carlo Acutis, so you can pray for whatever you are carrying right now, for the person who came to your mind in the last few minutes. It's in the description, the first link, right below this video. Download it and pray it over 9 days, in your own words, at your own pace. But before I can tell you why I, of all people, am the one asking you to pray, I'd have to tell you about the envelope, because that is where everything I believed began to die. Antonia Salzano did not behave like a woman protecting a lucrative myth. I had interviewed grieving parents who had monetized their loss. There is a particular performance to it, the practiced pause, the glance at the camera to check it's still recording, the way the story sharpens and improves each time it's told, until it's smooth as a stone. I knew the signs, the way a mechanic knows a bad engine by its sound. She met me at the Sanctuary of the Spoliation in Assisi, near where her son is buried. She was smaller than I expected. She spoke quickly, in accented but excellent English, and she did something no media-trained subject ever does. She contradicted herself. She got dates slightly wrong and corrected herself. She admitted that for the first years after Carlo died, she had been angry at God, that she had not wanted any of this. The website, the fame, the pilgrims. "I had a dead son," she said. "I did not want a saint. I wanted my son." That threw me. Liars don't volunteer their own anger at God. Liars give you a clean product. I pressed on the money. The website hosting the Eucharistic Miracle exhibition, I pointed out, now traveled to thousands of parishes worldwide. There were books, films, a tomb that drew 1 million pilgrims a year to a town that lived on tourism. Someone, I said, was profiting enormously. She nodded, completely unbothered. "Assisi profits," she said. "The hotels profit. I'm sure someone, somewhere, sells a bad keychain with my son's face on it, and it makes me sick. The website was free when Carlo built it, and it is free now. He coded it himself, on a secondhand computer. He taught himself from manuals. She smiled in a way that wasn't for any camera. He was not a genius. He was an ordinary boy who was extraordinarily, stubbornly good. That is the only miracle that matters, and it is the one nobody wants to film. And then she told me about the website's purpose, and it stopped me. Carlo, she said, had a phrase he repeated. He'd say that all of us, standing in line to get into a concert or a football match, would queue for hours for something that lasts 90 minutes. But we wouldn't stand in line for the one who waits for us in every church on earth. The Eucharist, she said, quoting her son, is my highway to heaven. I had heard that line before, in the press packets. Coming from a press packet, it was a slogan. Coming from his mother, in that small room, it sounded like the actual sentence a 15-year-old had actually said. The difference was unbearable to me, because I made my living on exactly that difference, and for the first time, my instrument was failing me. I could not detect a lie, because there wasn't one. I asked her one more question, the cruel one, the one I'd been saving. I asked her how she could be sure her son hadn't simply been a sick, lonely boy who retreated into religion because he had no friends and no life. She didn't flinch. She told me Carlo had loved video games and the Spider-Man movies, and that he limited himself to 1 hour of gaming a week through sheer discipline. She told me he had defended classmates who were bullied, that he had taken food to the homeless men near his home in Milan using his own pocket money, that immigrant families in his building came to him because he helped their children with homework and dealt with their landlords. He had friends. He had a dog. He had a life. And he gave large portions of it away, quietly, while he had it. Then she said the thing that closed the second mystery I'd carried into that room, the question of why this case felt so different from every fraud I had cracked. You keep looking for the lie, she said gently. There is no lie to find. That is what is destroying you. You came expecting a wall, and you have walked through the door, and now you don't know where you are. She was right. I had spent a week looking for the contradiction that always exists, and its absence had become its own kind of evidence. And I hated that thought, because it sounded like the thinking of the very people I despised. I was about to leave, and that is when she mentioned the boy in Brazil. If you downloaded that novena I mentioned, you already understand what I mean about a story that won't let you go. If you haven't yet, it's still there, the first link in the description, and you can pray it for the one person you keep thinking about while you listen to this. I keep gathering stories like mine here, traces of something I spent my whole life denying. But what Antonia told me next, about a boy in Brazil and a date she made me write down, is the reason I ended up on live television 3 weeks later, taking off my microphone. The boy's name was Mateus. He lived in Campo Grande, in Brazil. In 2013, he was a small child, and he was dying. Antonia told me the story plainly, the way she told everything. The child had a severe congenital defect of the pancreas. He could not process food properly. He vomited constantly, was wasting away, and the doctors had given the family little hope. A priest in the boy's parish was promoting devotion to Carlo Acutis, who was not yet beatified, and on a particular day in 2013, the family brought Mateus to venerate a relic of Carlo, a piece of fabric, and the child was encouraged to pray, to ask Carlo to intercede for him. She told me to write down the date, so I wrote it down, not because I believed anything, but because I am trained to record what witnesses emphasize. The boy, she said, told his mother afterward that he had asked to stop vomiting. That was his prayer, a child's literal request. He wanted to stop vomiting. He stopped that day, and when the doctors examined him afterward, the pancreatic tissue had reconstituted, not improved, restructured. The Vatican Medical Board, a body that includes non-believing physicians whose job is precisely to throw cases out, had spent years trying to find a natural explanation and had failed to find one. This was the first miracle, the one that made Carlo blessed in 2020. I left Assisi with this in my notes, and I attacked it the only way I knew how. I flew to Brazil. I want to be clear about who I was at this point. I was not softening. I was hardening. Every unbroken thread had made me more determined, because in my experience, the biggest frauds are the ones that survive the most scrutiny. They survive precisely because they are run by intelligent people. I went to Campo Grande convinced that this child's medical records would be the seam, a misdiagnosis, a spontaneous remission relabeled as a miracle. Doctors are wrong all the time, and I would prove these had been. I found the family. I found the original treating physician, a man with no stake in the canonization, a secular doctor who had since moved to a different hospital. And I asked him, recorder running, to give me the natural explanation. He didn't have one. I sat across from him and I watched him try. He pulled up the imaging. I'm not a doctor, but he walked me through it, the before and after. He told me, in the careful, hedging language of a scientist who hates the word miracle, that he had no medical framework for what he had seen. The congenital malformation was documented. The reconstruction was documented. He said the boy was now a healthy teenager. And then he said, almost angrily, I don't want to say the word you want me to say, but I cannot give you the word you came for either. That night, in a hotel in Campo Grande, the case I had built for 2 months began to invert in my hands. I had come to find a fraud and had instead assembled, piece by piece, a body of evidence that I would never have accepted from a believer, but that I was now collecting myself, with my own hands, with my own skepticism intact at every step. That was what frightened me. I trusted my own doubt more than anyone's faith, and my own doubt was not finding the floor. And there was a detail I had not yet processed, a small thing Antonia had said as I was leaving Assisi, that I would only understand later. She had said that Matthias, the healed boy, would one day become a doctor himself. She'd said it like a fact, not a wish. I had dismissed it, a mother's sentiment. But that detail, that throwaway prediction about a child's future career, would come back to me in a hospital corridor 3 years later and nearly stop my heart. I just didn't know it yet. When I flew back to Europe, I had stopped sleeping. The thing that finally broke the floor under me was not in Brazil. It was in Assisi, in a meeting I almost didn't have. Before I'd left Italy the first time, I had asked Antonia if I could speak with anyone who had known Carlo personally, outside the family. A friend, a teacher, someone who might give me the unguarded version. She had given me a name, a man named Tommaso, who had been a few years older than Carlo, and had, as a teenager, been one of the boys Carlo helped, a kid from an immigrant family in the apartment block whose homework Carlo did, and whose father Carlo had once defended to a landlord. Tommaso was now an adult, a father himself, and he lived near Assisi. I went to see him on my way back from Brazil, mostly to be thorough. I expected sentiment. I got something else. Tommaso was guarded with me. He didn't like journalists. He'd seen too many turn his friend into a cartoon. But when he understood that I was a skeptic, that I had come to tear Carlo down, something in him relaxed, strangely, as if he preferred an honest enemy to a dishonest fan. He talked for 2 hours. And then, near the end, he told me about the day Carlo predicted his own death. It was a few months before the leukemia. Carlo had no symptoms, no diagnosis, nothing. The boys were walking back from Mass, and Carlo said, out of nowhere, that he was going to die. Tommaso had laughed it off, but Carlo repeated it. He said he would die young, and he said he had offered his life and his suffering to God, for the Pope, and for the Church. He said it the way you might mention a holiday you've already booked. Tommaso said he had never forgotten it, because months later, the boy was dead, exactly as he'd said, of a disease nobody saw coming. I had a rational explanation ready. Adolescents are morbid. They say dramatic things. Coincidence does the rest. I even said this to Tommaso. He listened. And then he reached into a drawer and took out an envelope. Carlo gave things to people, he said. Little notes. He liked to write things down for people to open later. Most of us lost them. My mother kept this one for me. He turned it over in his hands. It was old, the paper yellowed, sealed. I'm not going to give you mine, he said, but Antonia told me you were the kind of person who needs to hold proof in your hands, so she wanted you to have this one. It was Carlo's. He left it for whoever came looking with a hard heart. Those were his words, my mother said. Antonia kept it for 19 years. He handed me an envelope, sealed. Carlo's handwriting on the front, faded but legible, in Italian. And he told me the one instruction that came with it. Don't open it, Tommaso said, until you reach the place where you finally believe. He wrote that on the back. Antonia says the same thing every time. Don't open it until you're on your knees. If you open it before, it's just paper. After, it's a key. I almost laughed. It was theatrical. It was exactly the kind of staged mysticism I'd come to expose. I took the envelope only because, as a journalist, I take everything. I slid it into the inner pocket of my coat, against my chest, the same pocket that had carried the forensic folder across the Atlantic. And I told myself I would open it that night, in my hotel, and photograph whatever vague horoscope-style prophecy was inside, and use it as the centerpiece of my takedown. I didn't open it that night. I can't fully explain why. I told myself it was for the cameras, that I'd film the opening for the documentary. But the truth I only admitted years later, was that some part of me was afraid of what was written there. So it stayed in my pocket, sealed, for 3 years. That seemed like the strange end of a strange trip. It was the beginning of the part one can barely talk about. I came home and I had to write the documentary. And I couldn't. My network had paid for a hit piece. The script I was contracted to deliver was supposed to call Carlo Acutis a manufactured saint. The website, a fundraising tool, the miracles, medical errors, the body, a wax mask. And I had spent 2 months and a great deal of the network's money gathering the exact opposite. I had a Brazilian doctor with no faith who could not explain a reconstructed pancreas. I had a forensic analysis of cardiac tissue from a host. I had a mother who contradicted herself like an honest person, and a dying boy on a ward who thanked his nurses. I had nothing to expose. So I tried to write the lie anyway. I sat at my desk under the framed Hitchens quote, and I tried to twist my own evidence into the shape my contract required. And every sentence I wrote turned to ash, because I knew it was false. And the one thing I had always told myself, through 19 years and 2 awards, was that I did not lie. I exposed liars. I was not one of them. We were scheduled for a live broadcast, a panel discussion, a teaser for the documentary, 3 weeks before air. I was to go on live and preview my findings. The network wanted a few inflammatory sound bites to build buzz. The truth behind the internet saint, that kind of thing. I sat in the studio that morning with the script in front of me and the envelope in my coat pocket, hanging on a hook in the green room down the hall. The anchor introduced me. He read out my credentials, my awards, my reputation for fearless exposés. He turned to me and asked, with a knowing smile, what I had found. Was the millennial saint a fraud? And I opened my mouth to read the script. And the words wouldn't come. I looked into the camera, into that red light, and I thought of Liana the nurse saying, I have seen actors die, and he was not one of them. I thought of the doctor in Brazil refusing to say the word I wanted and refusing to give me the word I came for. I thought of Antonia saying, you have walked through the door and you don't know where you are. And I said, on live television, to 40 million people, I came to prove this boy was a fraud. I spent 2 months, and I cannot do it, because he wasn't one. And I won't read you the lie that's on this card. The studio went silent. My producer was shouting in my ear. The anchor tried to recover, tried to laugh it off, tried to cut to break. And I reached up and unclipped the microphone from my jacket and set it on the desk and said the last sentence of my career. I quit. I walked off the set. I collected my coat with the envelope still in it. And by the time I reached the street, my phone was already detonating with messages. The network's lawyers, my agent, every colleague I had. The clip was online before I got home. They called it a breakdown, a conversion, a publicity stunt. My agent dropped me. My contract was voided. Within a month, my career of 19 years was simply gone. And here's the part nobody believes. I still did not believe in God. Not yet. I had only refused to lie. I had stood up for the truth as a journalist, which is a very different thing from kneeling before it as a soul. I had concluded, professionally, that I could not disprove these things. That is not the same as faith. I went home an unemployed atheist who happened to have failed to debunk a saint. The envelope stayed sealed. I told myself I would open it when I finally believed, and since I didn't believe, it stayed shut. It moved with me from the apartment I could no longer afford to a small rented flat. It sat in a drawer beside my father's blue coffee cup. For 3 years. Then I got the phone call about my own body. The headaches had started slowly, and I blamed the stress, the ruin of my career, the months of not sleeping. When I finally saw a doctor and they ordered scans, they found a mass at the base of my brain, pressing on something delicate, in a location that made surgery dangerous and the prognosis bad. I was 51 years old. I had no husband, no children, a dead father whose cup I still drank from, and a sealed envelope I'd refused to open. The best surgeon for my specific condition, I was told, was at a hospital in Sao Paulo, Brazil. There was a procedure, experimental, with a team there that had pioneered it. My ruined finances barely covered it. I flew to Brazil to have a stranger open my skull, in the same country where, years before, I had failed to debunk the healing of a boy named Mateus. I did not make that connection at first. I was too frightened. I was a dying woman in a foreign country with no one to hold my hand. The surgery did not go as planned. I'll spare the medical detail because I didn't understand most of it and was unconscious for the worst of it. There was a complication. My heart stopped on the table. The official record says I was without effective circulation for somewhere between 4 and 6 minutes, long enough that the team had begun to prepare the family they didn't know I didn't have. And then I came back. They restarted my heart, and the surgery, against the odds, succeeded. And the mass came out, and I woke up 2 days later in a recovery ward, alive, with no neurological damage anyone could measure. The surgeon who came to see me was young, Brazilian. He spoke careful English. He told me my recovery was, in his words, difficult to explain. And as he was leaving, a nurse called him by name and asked him a question, and he answered and turned back to me to apologize for the interruption. I asked the nurse afterward who he was. She said he was one of the youngest doctors on the unit, brilliant, that he'd grown up in Campo Grande. And she said his name, Mateus. I lay in that bed, and I felt the floor of the world tilt. I asked her, I made myself ask, whether this was the same Mateus who, as a child, years ago, had been the subject of a famous medical case. She gave me a strange look and said yes, everyone here knew the story, that the doctor rarely spoke of it, but it was true. He had been the child healed in the cause of the saint, the one who'd said he wanted to become a doctor, and had done exactly that. I had written down that detail, 3 years earlier, in my own hand, dismissing it as a mother's sentiment. He would become a doctor. And now that boy, grown, had stood over my body in the operating room, where my heart had stopped and started again. I asked for my coat. The nurse thought I was confused. I made her bring it. And from the inner pocket, where it had ridden against my chest across an ocean, I took out the envelope. Carlo's handwriting on the front. 19 years old now, plus the 3 I'd carried it. The instruction on the back, in faded Italian. Do not open this until you reach the place where you finally believe. I was on my knees on the floor of that hospital before I knew I'd moved. An atheist of 51 years, on a tile floor in Sao Paulo, in the exact place I had once gone to disprove a miracle, recovering from a death I shouldn't have survived, under the care of the very child whose healing I had failed to explain. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single small sheet of paper, folded once, in a 15-year-old's handwriting. It was dated. Carlo dated it himself, in the summer of 2006, months before he died. And it said, in Italian that the nurse later helped me translate fully because my hands were shaking too hard to read. To whoever opens this with a hard heart that has finally broken, you came to look for a lie and found there wasn't one. Don't be afraid. You won't believe because someone argued you into it. You'll believe in a hospital, far from home, when you understand that you were carried, even while you were running. I prayed for you. I don't know your name. God does. The Eucharist is my highway to heaven, and there's room on it for you too. He wrote that in 2006, before there was an internet saint, before any nicknames, before a website most people had never heard of, before I was anything but a young reporter who didn't believe in anything. A dying boy of 15 had written a letter to a stranger he would never meet, describing the precise interior condition of a woman who, decades later, would kneel on a hospital floor in a foreign country and finally stop running. Date, place, the hardness of a specific heart. I did not become a believer because the letter was a trick. I have spent my entire professional life detecting tricks. There was no mechanism. There was no chain of custody that allowed for it. The envelope had been in my own possession, sealed, in my own drawer beside my father's cup, for 3 years. I knelt on that floor and I wept the way I had not wept since my father died. And a Brazilian nurse I did not know knelt down beside me and held me, an atheist undone. And across the ward, somewhere, was a doctor named Mateus, who had once asked, as a small sick boy, only to stop vomiting, and had been answered. That was the day I believed, not the day I quit. 3 years later, on my knees, when I finally understood what the boy had written before he died. I have to tell you the rest, because believing was not the end. It was the beginning of a life I never planned to live. When I recovered enough to fly, I went back to Assisi. I went to the tomb in the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, where Carlo Acutis lies in his tracksuit and his sneakers, behind glass, and where over 1 million people a year come to pray. I went not as a journalist. I knelt there for a long time, and I told him, out loud, quietly, the way you talk to a friend, that I was the hard heart, that I had come to destroy him, and he had written to me before I was even worth writing to. I found Antonia. She was not surprised to see me. Mothers of saints, I have learned, stop being surprised by anything. I told her everything. The brain tumor, the surgery, my heart stopping, Mateus standing over me, the envelope. She held my hands, and she cried. And then she laughed, and she said, he always knew that one was for someone difficult. He told me, when he gave it to me to keep, that it was for the one who'd come to tear it all down. She had carried it for 19 years, handing it to me only when a skeptic with a hard heart finally walked through her door. And Carlo had written it for exactly that person, years before any of us existed in his story. Carlo Acutis was beatified on the 10th of October 2020 by Pope Francis in Assisi, and he was canonized, declared a saint of the Catholic Church, on the 7th of September 2025 by Pope Leo XIV during the Jubilee. I was there. I, who had flown to Italy to prove him a fraud, stood in a crowd of hundreds of thousands of people and watched a 15-year-old boy in sneakers be raised to the altars, and I understood that I had been written into his story before I had any idea he existed. I testified, eventually, before the people gathering the documentation of his continuing intercession. Not as a miracle. My recovery was never submitted as one, and I make no such claim. The doctors call it difficult to explain, and I leave it there. I testified only to what I am qualified to testify to, that a professional skeptic with 2 awards for exposing religious fraud spent 2 months and considerable resources trying to debunk this boy, and could not, and that a sealed letter written in 2006 described the interior of her heart 3 years before she opened it. That is not a medical miracle. It is something I cannot file under any other heading. I speak now to groups of people who once believed what I believed, the angry kind of atheist, the kind with a quote framed above the desk. I don't argue them out of it, because I was not argued out of it. I just tell them what happened, the way Liana, the nurse, told me, with nothing to gain. Believe me or don't. If this testimony has marked you the way my own life was marked, I ask you one thing. Subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who is running the way I was running. On this channel, we keep gathering the traces Carlo Acutis left all over the world, the small ones and the impossible ones. And if you want to carry something of this story with you, the free novena to Carlo is in the description, the first link right below this video. Pray it, share it, pray it for the hard hearts you love, and keep his memory alive. I still drink my coffee black every morning from my father's chipped blue cup. The Hitchens quote is gone from my wall. In its place is a small printed photograph of a boy in a tracksuit, smiling, who wrote me a letter before I was worth writing to, and who waited 19 years for me to open it. Carlo said the Eucharist was his highway to heaven. I spent my whole life proving that roads led nowhere. The traces of heaven are everywhere. You only have to know how to look.